Well, thank you for the organizers and the committee for including me here. I'm very excited to be here representing the junior investigator community. What I was hoping to accomplish today is to give you a sense of how this, both the lack of reproducibility, transparency, replicability affect us as junior investigators, but also try to share my perspective on what I think we could be doing to promote and improve this and create a cultural change. Something I'd like to emphasize that I think hasn't been discussed yet, and I don't think I have it as a bullet point, but I think that it will be very important to target the junior investigators, the starting from undergrad, graduate students, postdocs, so that we can. I feel that while it is great to try to bring back the old school science and try to change the mentality of the senior investigators, I think that if we can begin to create this awareness in the younger community, then hopefully we can begin to bring that into a shift in the mentality, because I think a lot of the issues are related to all the new investigators and the pressure that we have to publish in high impact, flashy science that, as Harvey said, sometimes is not even relevant biologically, but it's so cool because it's using all these very cool approaches and tools that people just get blindsided by it. And I work really hard with my team to try to bring back the biology. And I think that would be something that I'd like to see. So what I try to do is I'll try not to be too negative, but I'm a tenure track, so things tend to be quite negative in my. So I'll highlight I'll try to be to give the good and the bad, and I apologize if everything sounds bad. So how this affects me? I know that these things that I will say are not specific to junior investigators. As I said, it impacts a grad student, it impacts a postdoc, it impacts senior investigators. But the reason I think this is particularly important for junior investigators is because we're starting a new lab. The tenure clock starts clicking immediately, and you have this pressure to build this research program. Some people are fortunate to bring in a lot of preliminary data and all the techniques that they need, but part of the recruitment process is that people want to see that you are innovative and that you are applying new things and bringing new concepts into your field, right? So I think invariably from talking to many of the other tenure trackers, you are counting on the literature so that you can establish models and that you can set the foundation for your studies, right? And what's bad about this? What I think is that, at least in my experience, and again, speaking for many other tenure trackers, you have this beautiful program, everything sounds great, then when you go into the lab to try to replicate this, you just can't do it. And I'll give a very clear example in my experience. I've been a tenure track for 5 years, and I had the plan of studying the somatosensory component of pain. We're interested in how on pain mechanisms. So we wanted to study the somatosensory component of pain and the affective component of pain. This was a very strong component in my research program. And it took us, I had a lot of experience with the somatosensory component, and I was relying on the literature for the affective ones. It took us 2 years to replicate all the affective behaviors. So that became a big problem, and we are working on putting together a paper that describes what made the difference, as someone was mentioning before, sometimes it's just the floor, the ceiling, or these things that you don't even think about. The problem is that set us back in our research program. We're going to be evaluated. This is a trainee that spent 2 years frustrated trying to replicate this, and it's just really hard to get it done because the information was not complete in the papers. So we were unable to, we had to start from scratch, guessing what experimental conditions, what are the analyses. People don't necessarily report the raw values, so you have to kind of guess what the normalized data is, and when you're trying to know what is wrong here, am I getting too much or too little of whatever measure you're taking, you can't know if the data is normalized, right? So it's really hard to begin to troubleshoot these things. And that was a big challenge, and we have been able to overcome it, but it definitely affects our ability to move forward. And I know that I'm not the only tenure-track investigator that started with this particular plan and then decided, okay, I'm going down this other route because these experiments are being too hard, I can't replicate it. Now, from the point of view of the science and the biology, it's even more important because specifically in the pain models, just like in the example with the cancer studies, there's been a big issue about whether these animal models are even valid to study this question. And that is very important. So a lot of the affective behaviors that we study, we're trying to measure the quality of life, and that's a big concern in pain. And if we cannot replicate that, then the whole models are being questioned, and the pharmaceutical companies have trouble translating the science. And there's a lot of unfortunately, really bad fiasco stories in the pain field that after a lot of money was spent based on basic science, there's no outcome translationally. So I think that this is really important. Okay, I'm moving on to the good part. Now, what was good? What was good is that we had these other things that were also new that we needed to incorporate and were quite easy to replicate, even though there was no one in the lab that had ever done them. What was the difference between those two? That there was extremely detailed methods papers that even had videos and had just a lot of details. Colbert here has helped a lot on that, sharing his detailed experiments. And that makes it so that instead of 2 years, you're trying to replicate something in less than a week, the data is beautiful and you can validate and move forward with the scientific question. And then, as I mentioned, it was really useful to have the raw values so that, and individual data points, because something else is that, you see this effect, as we were discussing with the p-value and this p-value, but then when you're doing the experiments, you don't know the scatter, you don't know the variability that you're supposed to see, and that is important so that we can incorporate it in the experimental design. So I'd like to see more of the methods and these things incorporated. I think that while it is important to have them in the primary articles, I think that there should be a lot more appreciation for detailed methods paper, which is something that, for example, as a tenure track, no one will look at it and say, "Ooh, that was a great contribution," and it doesn't matter how much it's cited, because all they're looking at is it's not nature, it's not science. So who cares if I'm being contributing to the community? So that brings to this point that I'd like to see these aspects valued in concrete ways, so that it's not just that we're promoting this and we're saying, oh, you should behave, you should do the right thing, but we are humans and we work by reward. I mean, that's just the way it is. And I think that as much as people say we strongly committed to this, if you don't translate that into something that you can see, that there's a very high reward value to it, then people will not do it. And I think that right now, and I'm talking about the tenure process, but this is the same for grants, this is the same for moving up in your position. And everything is valuing how many papers you get and where are you publishing them. And again, no one really will see there. I think that the high-end journals do have methods paper, but they are for innovative new protocols, but not for making sure that the protocols that we're using routinely are described appropriately. So I like to see a change in that aspect. The other aspect is that these things take a lot of time, and while people in the community will say, "Oh, beautiful work," we used it in the journal club, everyone loved it. We used it for an example of how to conduct an experiment. You hear all these things, but it doesn't translate into the tenure process, and it doesn't translate into your ability to move up in your career. I could be wrong, but I think that is not even included in one of the questions when we are going up for tenure. No one is asking the people writing the letters, do you think this person is contributing to our ability to have transparent, open, and replicable science? And I think that those are the things that should be, just like with kids and with pets. I think that there needs to be reward, but there also needs to be some sort of penalty for the people that are not contributing in this way, so that these things can be weighed into their evaluations. This is a big problem in my lab. I think I'm a junior investigator with the soul of an ancient investigator, because I like notebooks, I like all these old school things, and I like to be able to know that everything is replicable in the lab. The problem is that my trainees are seeing that I'm treating them completely different than the trainees next door or the trainees down the hall. And the trainees down the hall are getting the big papers with the small sample sizes with very little reproducibility, and then they come back to me and they're like, what's going on? The other trainees are getting positions, the other trainees are moving up. So again, going back to, I think that we need to incentivize from the lower level so that people understand that this is a very important issue. And then this kind of goes together with what everyone knows and the complaining, but we have very little resources. Many times, as opposed to established people, we don't have a lot of senior people in the lab, so a lot of these things revolve on one-on-one. I have to make sure that my trainees show me all the data and that I teach them one-on-one. So I think that if as a tenure track or junior investigator, you're doing good on these aspects, even if you're going slower than the people that are not, then that needs to be acknowledged and compensated adequately. Yes, and kind of like it's when you're doing all these things, publishing takes longer. So, and there's no compensation, because right now everything is about how many papers do you have, where are you publishing them, and I like to see a change in that culture. Hopefully, when I move up to more senior positions, I can contribute to that. Now, what's been good is that. Or what I think, actually, there's no good here. These are the things I think can help, is restructure the evaluation so that we can concretely quantify and take into consideration these different aspects. Ask specific questions to the people writing letters. Are the studies conducted rigorous? Do they have a good sample size, as someone was mentioning earlier? Is the community replicating the findings and following, or just citing it because it's cool? That's a big difference in the impact. and create awards, like big awards. Just like we have awards for the coolest paper in the whole world, we should also have awards for people that are contributing to these things, both at all the levels, so that they can be recognized. And this is the last thing is what's been easier for me to do in the lab is to keep track of the experimental procedures and create that culture. We meet one-on-one. We are able to do this with some resistance because everyone else is not, or fewer people are, but we can still do it. All the experiments are performed blind, and the rule in the lab is that we have to replicate this at least from beginning to end at least once or twice, no matter the sample size. We do keep all these records, and it makes it easier for when we're publishing. However, the things that have been challenging is keeping, and I'm saying this because if anyone has suggestions for this poor tenure tracker on how to deal with this, I would appreciate it. So keeping all the raw data labeled, easily accessible and organized has been challenging. We always find it, but it's not a half an hour thing. It's usually like a long time. Teaching my trainees that it's okay to report data that is not perfect is very, very hard because they all they see in these big journals is the perfect stories. So I think that that's important for transparency. And you know, the whole like analyze and write methods as you go and as you collect data so that you don't forget details, kind of going back to the notebook, has also been challenging. So if anyone has advice for me, that would be great. What we're not doing in my field that I would like to see, I don't know how to go back, but I'll pass in this anyway, is the pre-registration. So our field, something that I see in the cognitive neuroscience community is that they're starting to do all this pre-registration of their studies, and it helps with the transparency and with what the actual intention of the study was, and that's something that in our field it's a little bit harder to see because there's a lot of concerns about being scooped and things like that. So that's all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.